rise to continue to highlight our shared history, Black history, with a focus on the Supreme Court's 1954 decision, Brown v. Board of Education. 2020 makes 66 years since that decision, and I think if I were to ask most of the people in this room, you would feel very confident about your general understanding around this landmark case. But Madam Speaker, it was once stated that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And with recent events, I'm led to believe that the significance of the Brown v. Board of Education decision is worth revisiting, especially as it's translated into modern day relevance. So, Madam Speaker, please allow me to briefly walk through the journey of Brown v. Board of Education to make a much larger point. In 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson affirmed the right of states to enforce racial segregation for the promotion of the so-called public good, which led to widespread racial disparities in education, economic, and social measures. It was in 1951 that the students in Farmville protested unequal conditions and then sued for an integrated school, which would later become part of the 1954 case. It would not be until the dawn of the Civil Rights Movement, the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling, that the majority of the Supreme Court would essentially concur with the dissent from the Plessy v. Ferguson case, where Justice John Marshall Harlan argued that segregation ran counter to the constitutional principle of equality under the law, and that separate but equal education, in fact, were not equal at all. But meanwhile, Madam Speaker, in Virginia, U.S. Senator Byrd encouraged massive resistance to school desegregation, and Virginia strongly embraced laws to prevent a single Black child from entering any white school, with places like Norfolk, Prince Edward County, Surrey, and others joining in to put measures in place to remain separate. It would be decades before some of these measures would be undone. But ultimately, Madam Speaker, Brown versus Board versus Education set the legal precedent that would be used to overturn laws enforcing segregation in other public facilities, and much more. But we now know its historic verdict fell short of achieving its primary mission of fully integrating the nation's public schools. As Brown versus Board of Education was implemented throughout the country, putting an end to de jure segregation, we have found that so many students in present day are still among the fights for their constitutional rights for a quality public education and a system that remains de facto school segregation. One might even say, 66 years later, we remain separate and still unequal. Madam Speaker, if we look specifically at Virginia, according to the Commonwealth Institute, it's largely students of color that are feeling these impacts. 80% of students in high poverty schools are students of color. 60% Black, 18% Latinx, and 2% Asian. National data shows that school districts that predominantly serve students of color receive an average of $23 billion less in funding than mostly white school districts in the United States, despite serving the same number of students. Further data shows that the problem of school segregation legally continues to persist long after Brown v. Board of Education, and it's a direct correlation to school funding. Too many of our Black and brown students are largely overrepresented in high poverty schools. An increasing number of students find themselves in under-resourced schools and with inexperienced instructors, limited coursework, and fewer instructional resources. And to be clear, Madam Speaker, high poverty schools are located across the Commonwealth. Most of these schools are in the greater Richmond and Hampton Roads area, two areas with high percentages of Virginia's Black population. Other divisions with many high poverty schools include Norfolk, Roanoke City, Prince William, Newport News, Danville, Hampton, Henrico, and the list goes on. In Petersburg, almost all of their schools, 7 of their 8, meet the criteria as being considered high poverty. That's the same number of schools as Fairfax County, where 7 of 8 of almost 200 schools were in high poverty. Madam Speaker, there's no shortage of data that proves the direct quality of life for an individual starts and ends with the quality of education they receive. In just one example, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, their data shows that the differences that exist within under-resourced and underfunded schools have been proved by the labor market to those attending predominantly white schools that they will make less earnings. And furthermore, their data shows that the educational level of parents is equally important to the influence on their children's educational attainment. With this information, Madam Speaker, I can't help but think, if there was discrimination in the allocation of school resources and funding in previous generations, and we haven't greatly changed the practices that the next generation, the current generation, is enduring, exactly what type of life, what type of quality of life are we setting up the current Black and brown children to have? I know this to be true from the very families that I talk to. I know this to be true in more than conjecture because they tell me of the conditions of the schools when they were there and what their students, their children, are currently experiencing. So my point, Madam Speaker, is while Brown versus Board of Education may have shattered the racial apartheid of Jim Crow, many of our countries and our Commonwealth schools remain racially imbalanced and educationally inequitable. Having said that, Madam Speaker and members of this body, I'm so proud to be a member of the committee led by Chairman Torian that has made historic investments in K-12 and early education. And I know that each and every person here cares tremendously about education, generally speaking, and we are making progress. But I would be remiss if I did not say, just because we've done more, that does not mean our work is done. As I begin to close, Madam Speaker, in my research, I came across a very recent Washington Post article a few days ago that talked about the work taking place in Loudoun County to preserve the records from their Black rural schoolhouses from between the end of the Civil War and the 1970s. And one of the things this article talks about is its petitions from Black teachers seeking improvements for their students. Some of those petitions were to have running water, toilets, coal, and quality school books like their white counterparts. And today, Madam Speaker, having visited some of the schools in Petersburg and sat in those classrooms volunteering to help my teachers, I am officially renewing the petition and the call for my kids, for your kids, and the kids that so many of us represent. A petition for resources to have windows that keep our classes warm in the winter. The AC units to keep them cool in the spring. And the roofs, Madam Speaker, to keep them dry in any storm. And the funding, Madam Speaker, for the resources to support every school, every child, every teacher, that unfortunately in some cases are as much needed today, especially for our Black and brown students, as they were when these petitions were originally cast. And with that, Madam Speaker, I hope each and every one of you, if you haven't, will take some time to go and sit in one of your needier schools, and you will consider deeply what I've shared today and how we can remain committed to the true purpose of Brown versus Board of Education and the work required to get there. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and members of this body for allowing me to highlight our shared history, our Black history in this moment. Thank you.